I think we might make a start, everyone. So welcome to the first in our series of the Quality Teaching Academy PhD Showcase webinars. And this afternoon, we're going to hear from two of our PhD students. And if we haven't already met, my name's Rob Barter, and I'm one of the Quality Teaching Round advisors here at the University of Newcastle. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we start. Our presenters, Anthony and Brooke, only have about 20 minutes each to go through a fair bit with you. And what I'd like you to do is please refrain from your questions until the end. But more importantly, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sally Patfield, who will introduce our guest for today in just a minute. And then, as I said, after our presenters go through their research with you, there'll be time for questions at the end. But before we do start, it's important that we acknowledge country. And the land from which we're broadcasting today is the Pambalong Clan's traditional lands, part of the Awabakal people here in Newcastle. So we would like to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and welcome Indigenous colleagues joining us today. We also invite you to add your country or land beside your name if you want in the Zoom function, if you are happy to do that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sally, and Sally can give you a bit of a briefing and introduce our wonderful PhD candidates for this webinar. Thank you, Sally.
So thanks so much, Rob, and thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. So as Rob said, my name's Sally Patfield. I work here in the TTRC as a Senior Research Fellow. So while a lot of you are probably familiar with a lot of our larger projects on quality teaching and quality teaching rounds, you're probably less familiar with some of our smaller research projects. And the aim of these webinars is to really give you a bit of a taste of some of the things that are otherwise happening in the centre that you're probably less familiar with. So in the TTRC, we have a research program here for PhD students that is supported more broadly at the university as well. And we have quite a number of students who engage in different kinds of research. So today we welcome two of our PhD students. We have Anthony Ryan, who's going to be talking to you about his research on implementation science, and Brooke Rosser, who's going to be talking to you about her research looking at the impact of quality teaching and quality teaching rounds in terms of teacher social capital. So I'll hand it over to Anthony. So as Rob said, questions at the end, feel free to pop any questions into the chat as we go. And we can answer those at the end. So I'll hand it over to Anthony.
Okay, thanks a lot for that, Sally. There appears to be a minor technical issue in that the slides are advancing automatically, so I'll try and take care of that as we go along. But yeah, that's not seeming to work properly at the moment, so I'll just try and go back to the start if I can. Rightio. Okay, so I'm a third year PhD student, or final year PhD student, in fact, looking at implementation science, looking at implementing interventions and scaling interventions in schools. The talk that I'll give you today is associated with implementing QTR in schools, but also would apply equally to almost any other sort of relatively complex implementation that you're looking to undertake in your school. So there are general principles and rules that are in it, which hopefully are used to you in your school for other activities that you're looking to implement. So I'll get started. Okay. Technology doesn't want to play ball. Okay, just a quick overview of the presentation. So just quick introduction of the area that I'm looking at, the literature that's been developed in the area of implementation science, implementation models. Wouldn't be a good PhD student without coming up with the implementation model of my own, phases of implementation, conclusion, and recommendations for your school. So right, yeah. Okay, just a general introduction. So as over the last 3 years, I've sort of become aware that in terms of implementing interventions in schools, there's basically a need to conduct a customized approach to implementation. Previously, people have tried to have a one-size-fits-all approach, and I think that's sort of led to a large number of failures in education, unfortunately, because the need to have a customized approach stems from the fact that while schools have common structures, they have specific contexts and internal dynamics that change, which impact on the actual way you implement any sort of intervention. So my research is based around implementation science. So I'll go through and explain what implementation science is and how it's used. But hopefully, through the lens of implementation science, we can produce some practical considerations for implementing QTR in your school. Okay, what is implementation science? Implementation science is essentially just the science of implementing. So it's the scientific study of methods to promote systematic uptake of research findings. In 2008, Declan Butler came up with this concept, the Valley of Death, which is that picture that sits to the side, which basically describes on one side, you have the nice people in the lab coats developing all these interventions and other sort of technical wizardry. And on the other side, you have the poor practitioners that are actually trying to use the stuff that gets developed. And so over that period, the idea of implementation science is to essentially bridge the gap and to make sure that, you know, potentially positive interventions don't die just because they weren't implemented properly. So implementation science attempts to develop scientific methods to do that. It was developed in the health sciences, but my research over the last few years has indicated that it's equally applicable in the field of education. Okay, there's a bit of background on implementing QTR. I'm sure you guys are pretty well aware of that, so I won't go into it in detail unless anybody specifically wants me to, but if anybody wants the slides at the end of the presentation, well, we can forward them to you, but I assume that your background, you'll have a pretty decent background on quality teaching around, so I won't go into detail on that. Moving on. Okay, the main issue, I suppose, that I've sort of, you know, that's become apparent through my study is that there's this thing called the implementation paradox, which essentially means that when people develop interventions, so like they'll come up with a new evidence-based practice, the first thing that you do in what can call efficacy trials is you control for variables. So what you attempt to do is to isolate, you know, the actual impact of the intervention, and you screen out all the other variables where possible. The only problem is that when you actually go to implement that intervention that you've developed in the lab under controlled conditions, you implement in the exact same variables that you try to control for in the first place. So that causes you significant issues when there are changes in those in the variables that actually sit in the background that you try to control for. So I'll first go by explaining some of the literature which relates to implementation. The variability that I was talking about in context has been identified as a major cause of, you know, the failure of taking many of the interventions in education to scale. Unfortunately, much of it has also been retrospective in nature, which means that they tend to look at things after they've occurred, but not much work about how you actually implement something moving forwards. So that is a limitation with a lot of the research that exists. And the implementation is also quite complex because it involves a number of domains that all interact with each other. And unfortunately, schools, as you are well aware, are very complex settings to start with. So actually trying to implement something in a complex setting is, yeah, indeed quite complex. And so the research is also heading towards this concept that there's a unique pairing of the context and a specific intervention for each implementation site. Okay. So my general thinking over the last few years is that there's a need to consider implementation as a holistic endeavor. Trying to isolate individual parts of the actual implementation process is quite, can be fraught with danger because you can get combinations of factors which end up resulting in different effects. Whereas if you only look at individual factors, then, you know, you end up with like a smaller picture of the whole implementation process. So I think where possible, if you try and keep all the balls in the air and try and consider implementation as a holistic endeavor, I think you'll be better placed to actually implement relatively complex interventions. Okay, so like I said before, as a good PhD student, I developed my own model. So this is an implementation model. It essentially considers 4 domains that are required to actually have which are required to actually have implementation occur. So you have the context, and then you have which is just the setting of the intervention. Oh, it's not advancing, it's not good. Then you have the barriers and facilitators. So these are just barriers or things that exist in the school setting or in the process of implementing that can either work as barriers or facilitators. There is some overlap between the context and the barriers. And I suppose I've developed a more updated model of this, but for the meantime, I think it's good to consider the 4 areas in isolation and then their interaction between each other. So you have an inner setting, outer setting, the people actually implement the process, and the process of implementation and the intervention itself. Together, if you go through the implementation process, you end up with implementation outcomes. They differ from intervention outcomes because they're the actual result of what you've done. So how successfully did you implement the program? So what sort of fidelity, what sort of dosage, the cost that occurred, and the feasibility. So unfortunately, what becomes obvious is there are a lot of factors at play here that are starting to interact with each other. And that's even before you get to the actual intervention outcome, which is the part that you actually want to achieve in the end. So the intervention outcome, given that the time that it takes for most interventions to become effective, usually between 2 to 4 years for complex interventions, it's good to have both final and intermediate outcomes. If you can consider this as a group and consider it holistically, I think it's a good model to consider implementing something like QTR in a school. Okay. Now, just to add even more complexity to the issue, I didn't really want to do it, but I had to. When you actually go through implementing any intervention, you're going to go through a number of phases. So as soon as you enter the temporal elements, the timing elements, then you also have to consider how that's going to impact on the implementation domains. So I've used the EPIS model, which is essentially just taken off from the first 4 letters of the words that make it up. So you have the exploration, planning, implementation, and sustainment phases. So if you can consider the implementation domains across those phases, you'll be well placed to implement an intervention, and the earlier that you can do it, the better. So if you consider the context right at the exploration phase, that'll allow you to have more information and be able to better plan and implement and sustain as you move forward. So the earlier that you consider those domains in the actual process, the more flexibility you have to actually do something and to be able to make changes, make adaptations, or create new implementation strategies. So if you use this sort of matrix structure, I think it's a good framework for actually implementing interventions. Okay, so I'll just go through each of those 4 stages and just give you maybe some of the tips that we've come across. And we've done a study of implementation in 119 schools across New South Wales, and also done a case study to look at implementation in detail. So in terms of exploration, essentially as much time as you can invest time up front, and it'll be rewarded at the end. So essentially you need to establish the needs, capability, and capacity for your school to take on that intervention. The context is the elements of place, like the physical elements and also the fixed elements that your school has, and also dynamic elements such as culture and perceptions of leadership and other issues where those elements of context can vary through your implementation process. And if possible, you should try and match the intervention to the context that you're looking to implement in. And again, as early as possible, if you can form a partnership with either the intervention developer or an implementation team, that allow you to leverage the assets and the tools and the skills of the 2 groups. And we found that's been really helpful in the case study we conducted, and also identifying champions. So that gives the points of contact in schools, and also gives people to that really want to push forward, and that's found to be really useful in terms of trying to implement interventions. Okay, so it's just to reiterate, context frames everything. So if you're looking to implement, it's the context that it occurs in that's going to really frame the way that it occurs in your school. Okay. In terms of school context, I suppose I put up a slide just to give you an idea of what happens when there are variations in context. So on the side, I've got like 6 characteristics of schools and a series of different categories for those schools. When you look at producing interventions, invariably that work results in taking just an average of all those and saying, okay, this intervention works in the average of these settings. But the problem that you'll encounter with schools is that schools are in fact not made up of the average, but they're made up of individual characteristics. So another school will have a completely different profile. So implementation between those schools will look differently. So if you're, if you're a remote school versus a not remote school, your school size differs, then you're likely to have issues with just adopting a one size fits all approach. So basically that's why I included that slide in the process. Okay. Slide advancing. Okay, now we're going to. Okay, yeah, just a slide advance isn't working properly anyway. The second phase is the actual planning stage. So hopefully you can take the information you've got from the exploration phase and put it into this process, and you can plan the implementation in your school. You can develop strategies to suit the context that you're implementing in. And it's a good time at this stage to develop measurement and feedback, particularly when you get to the final stage where you work out whether the interventions actually had positive results in your school. Okay. The third stage is the stage where the rubber hits the road, and a lot of people probably just jump straight in the implementation phase without doing too many of the earlier work. So at this stage, you need to consider all the implementation domains, beware of interactions that occur between domains. So is the context impacting the determinants, and are they affecting the way you end up having is that impacting the implementation domains? Don't expect a smooth linear improvement. We've seen like it just jumps all over the place, but hopefully you'll end up with a positive end result. And if you can, if at all possible, feedback the data that you're collecting through the process and make changes to suit and to head towards the direction you want to. And expect that the change will take a significant period of time, so I can consider intermediate incomes. Okay, I put the model up again just so that you can see the 4 areas and them interacting, and just being mindful of the fact that that interaction occurs between domains. Okay, this slide just points out the sort of the variability in results that you get as you proceed through a change process. So it's not smooth and linear, it'll jump up and down, but generally, hopefully, if you follow this is a change in morale that was measured for teachers in a school, and hopefully if you can get the average situation for the classroom teacher or the head teacher, where at least over the length of the process, the level of the change in school morale has been positive. Okay. And then you enter the 4th stage, which is the sustainment phase. At this stage, essentially, you have to work out whether you want to persist with the intervention, whether it's been of value to you. Hopefully the data that you've collected along the way will assist you in that process. And then if you decide to continue with the intervention, then you're probably looking at changing the type of activities you do, and you enter into a period where you are looking at just monitoring and continuing on with the process. But you also have to decide at that stage, any of the short-term barriers that you've overcome, you need to swap across to business as usual in the school, so that it becomes embedded in the school for that part of the process. And essentially you just have to determine where the outcomes are better than the cost. So in this phase, you'll maybe need to enter essentially like a maintenance type phase, and also you may need to retrain teachers who are just joined the school or haven't had any of the training before. Okay, so it's just in conclusion, consider implementation as a holistic endeavor. So you need to consider those 4 domains and consider that implementation involves the context that you're the setting that the intervention is occurring in, the complexity that's involved, unfortunately, is significant, and the change that you're looking to achieve. But fortunately, well, from the research that I've conducted, QTR can be implemented across a wide range of settings. So I haven't seen a setting yet where it won't work so long as it's adapted sensibly and consideration has been taken for the implementation strategies. Just some general recommendations that we found along the way is the value of co-design in a partnership where the school and the developer get benefits from joining together and use their resources more efficiently. Spend time up front where you can to make sure that you're well set up and you're well aware of the context and you've got the measurement in place to conduct your intervention. Ensure there's a good match between context and intervention. And if you are going to make changes to suit your context, make sure you don't change the core of the actual intervention. So delivery and other processes are okay, but when you start to mess with the core of a process, you may end up with problems and not get the results that were originally achieved in efficacy trials. And unfortunately, to end with, don't expect a smooth path to improvement, but if you do consider all those things, it is possible to actually achieve improvement through consideration of all those elements. Thanks. So I'll just try and finish up and give Brooke some time. So, okay, I'll hand over now to Brooke.
So thanks very much, Anthony. So like we said at the start, we will leave questions for both presenters to the end, but feel free to pop anything in the chat that you have thought of or pop anything else in the chat while Brooke's presenting. But now over to you, Brooke.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming along to hear about our PhD research. So my name's Brooke. I'm going to share with you some preliminary findings from my study, which looks at the impact of QTR on teachers' professional relationships and examines the capacity of QTR to build teachers' social capital. We'll see how this slide progression is working for me. So have you ever heard any of these common English phrases before? You may have even said one yourself. It's not what you know, but who you know that counts, particularly relevant when you're applying for a job. I heard it on the grapevine or from a friend of mine. There's strength in numbers. It takes a village to raise a child. It takes 2 to tango. These kinds of proverbs, I think some of them are idioms and others cultural truisms. And I'm not entirely sure if they have them in other languages, but some of my colleagues who speak other languages seem to think that they might be similar ones elsewhere. But they've revealed 2 quite important facts about relationships. So first, relationships can be beneficial for individuals and groups. And second, the success of some actions actually depend on collaboration among individuals. So Pierre Bourdieu, who's a French sociologist, or I should say was, he's passed away now, whose work I draw on quite heavily in my study, wrote that it often happens that ordinary language designates very important social facts, but it masks them at the same time by the effect of familiarity, which leads one to imagine that one already knows that one has understood everything, and which stops research in its tracks. Part of the work of social science consists in discovering what is both unveiled and veiled by ordinary language. So the idea that relationships are beneficial runs the risk of stating the obvious. But Bourdieu's point here is that obviousness hides the fact that we may not fully understand how or why or in what circumstances that is the case. What sorts of relationships, with whom, under what conditions, for what purposes are they beneficial? There's a couple of theoretical perspectives out there which attempt to address some of these questions. So the 2 main ones are social network theory, which tells us that the structure of social networks can influence individual and group attitudes, behaviors, and even their performance. So from social network theory, we get the notion that, okay, relationships matter. Then we have a whole bunch of what Lynn calls neo-capital theories. So with these theories, there's the idea that there are many forms of capital, not just financial or economic capital. There's also physical capital, human capital, cultural capital, and social capital. So as a form of capital, social relationships seen as an asset, as a productive thing that enables individuals and groups to achieve things they couldn't do so alone, like raising children or dancing the tango. So from these perspectives, we get this notion of social capital, which is commonly understood as the ability of individuals and groups to access valuable resources through relationships. Note here, I've italicized valuable resources because what's valuable depends on the purpose to which it'll be used. So something to keep in mind as we go through. Probably wondering by this point, what has this got to do with teachers? Well, there's been a surge in research interest in notions of teachers' social capital over the past 20 years. And this has coincided with a much broader public and academic interest in notions of social capital and also notions of social networks. So the figure that you can see on the screen is a scan from my copy of Robert Putnam's revised edition of Bowling Alone. So this was a seminal text, Bowling Alone, which documented the decline in civic engagement in the US at the national level during the 20th and 21st century. So this graph is showing a sharp increase in press mentions and scholarly articles related to social capital in general since the mid-90s. So the interest in teacher social capital is kind of coming off the back of these broader trends. For the purpose of improving teaching and learning, we can think of teachers' social capital as the ability of teachers to access valuable intellectual, social, and material resources for teaching through collegial relationships. And those resources for teaching are pretty broad. It can be information, advice, social support, teaching materials, etc. And there are different perspectives on the factors that influence the degree to which an individual or group possesses social capital. So we can think of it as a multi-dimensional construct. So there's a structural perspective, which draws our attention to the way that social networks are structured in schools and where teachers are positioned in those networks. There's a relational perspective, which points to the quality of professional relationships among staff. A connectionist perspective, which looks at the presence of shared goals, values, norms, and language. And then a connectionist perspective, which draws attention to the quality of resources that are actually exchanged through professional relationships. So all of these things, perspectives are thought to kind of interact to influence the degree of social capital. So taking stock of the literature on teacher social capital, just last year, the first systematic review was published by DeMere. It included 66 studies that had been conducted since 2005 and found positive association between teacher social capital and 5 categories of positive outcomes. And they were teacher learning and development, the successful implementation of change efforts in schools, the induction of new and beginning teachers, higher teacher retention and job satisfaction, and higher student achievement. These quite positive findings have led to some proponents advocating that school improvement efforts, including teacher professional development, should be focusing on enhancing teachers' social capital. So some of you might be aware of Hargreaves and Fullen's notion of professional capital. Well, social capital is a key part of that. So professional capital consists of human, social, and decisional capital among teachers. So they write that social capital strategies are one of the cornerstones for transforming the profession, and that the key variable that determines the success of any innovation is the degree of social capital in the culture of your own school. While I agree with the sentiment, and I am excited that research is accumulating around the importance of social capital, the problem is we don't know how best to build and sustain teacher social capital in schools. And this is, oh, sorry, no, I'm getting ahead of myself. So some barriers here. Research on school organisation and the natures of teachers' work point to a siloing effect of school organisation. So a lot of teachers' work is carried out solo in the classroom, and where collaboration does occur, it's often within stages and within subject faculties. Then there's also the physical infrastructure of schools, so separate or communal staff rooms, the actual locations of faculties and stages within the physical school buildings. So all of these affect who teachers formed relationships with. We also have some insights from social network research on the principles that govern, sorry everybody, I'm just trying to get my slide to go back, the principles that affect who teachers form ties with, and I'm not sure if I can even get back there. Sorry. Thank you, Sally. Okay, so what we get from social network research is that teachers tend to form ties on the basis of homophily, proximity, and perceptions of expertise. So teachers tend to form relationships with colleagues who they perceive as being similar to themselves. So in terms of their role, specialization, age, interests, etc. Also teachers who are physically close to them. So location in school buildings is a factor. But also we have perceptions of expertise. So teachers tend to seek out others who they perceive as having expertise. To be able to do this successfully, though, you need to know who has what expertise in the school. And the issue with the siloing effect is that a lot of the times teachers aren't aware of exactly who knows what. So there's kind of like a missed opportunity there almost. We also get from decades of research on efforts to promote collaboration in communities that interventions can actually produce weak and contrived forms of collegiality that don't do much to improve teaching and learning and could even damage existing relationships. So simply working together isn't enough either. This all points to the fact that we need to carefully assess the impact of any interventions on teachers' professional relationships to see whether or not they increase social capital. And let me see if I can change. Okay. And this is where my PhD comes in. So I'm looking at the impact of teachers' social QTR on teachers' professional relationships and examining the capacity of QTR to build social capital. So like Anthony said, I won't go into QTR in great detail, but for teachers, forming a professional learning community, observing each other, discussing teaching and using the quality teaching model in a nutshell. Why QTR? Well, prior research conducted by myself and colleagues has indicated that QTR has a positive impact on teachers' professional relationships. I want to take the opportunity to actually examine this through the lens of social capital. So that's what I'm doing in my research. My study is embedded in a much larger randomized controlled trial of the impact of quality teaching rounds on student achievement that was conducted by the Teachers and Teaching Research Centre in 2021. So in the trial, groups of 4 primary school teachers got together to form a PLC, and they were randomly allocated to either participate in QTR, an alternative intervention called peer observation, or just simply do PD as usual at their school. So in those PLCs, 2 of the teachers must have been a stage 2 teacher for the achievement testing purposes that were part of the RCT. But the other 2 teachers could be made up from teachers from any stage within the primary school. All the interventions were implemented in term 2 of 2021. And then to answer my research questions, I interviewed a subsample of teachers and leaders from the QTR group in terms 3 and 4. So I did 2 lots of interviews. The first were for the larger RCT that were kind of focusing on general impacts of QTR, and that was with 10 teachers and 7 leaders. And then I did a second set of interviews, which were specifically for my own research that really focused on professional relationships and social capital. And I conducted those with an extra 5 teachers. So of the sample, mostly female, half more than 10 years experience, half had been at their schools for more than 5 years. Most of the interviewees were teachers who actually participated in QTR, or they may have also been in leadership roles, but they were involved in the rounds. Where I've got indicated leader there, those interviewees weren't involved themselves. They observed other teachers at their schools participate. Almost all of the schools, the interviewees in my study were almost from all schools in major cities, mostly middle and high ICSIA schools. So these findings may not generalise to all teachers or schools, especially those in remote areas and with higher levels of disadvantage. But also most schools were learning from home for all of term 3 that year due to COVID. So that meant that it wasn't a typical school year for the majority of study participants, and that also needs to be considered when, I guess, assessing the findings. So my preliminary analysis of these interviews, they were all audio recorded, transcribed, checked for accuracy, and then de-identified. And then I did some focused and thematic coding of that interview data. And I did that according to 3 of the dimensions of social capital I mentioned earlier. So the structural dimension, thinking here, actual ties, networks, position within networks, connectivity, resource flows, that kind of thing. Relational dimension, we're talking about the quality of relationships, so trust, norms, group identification. And in the cognitive dimension, we're looking at things like shared understanding, narratives, languages, and goals. So what I found was, in relation to the structural dimension, interviewees reported forming new professional relationships with colleagues that they hadn't had the chance to work with before, and engaging in more frequent and ongoing interactions after QTR. So I've got a sample of some quotes here, not all of them, but just a couple that I think are quite illustrative. So the names there are all pseudonyms as well. They're not real teachers' names. So Gina said that Scarlett and I now we're actually talking to each other. We barely did before. And then we were engaging these conversations. I'd be like, oh, I need some differentiated work for my IO student. What do you think? And she would give me work. Then we'd have these really professional, engaging conversations where we did not before. Jackson, who was a principal that observed the teachers participate in QTR, said, after QTR, we had a number of our older year teachers engaging with kindergarten, which never happens, to get ideas or saying, when you were teaching literacy, I noticed that you had these resources. I think they'd be really good for the students in my class. So probably that informal discussion was a positive of QTR. It was really just them taking it upon themselves to go and have a chat. And then Vivian, who participated in QTR with another small school. So they actually, two schools formed together to get a PLC of 4 so that they were able to participate. She said, I think doing QTR across schools was actually helpful. It makes collaborations possible in the future. I know the person that we did it with at one school, we ended up being a guest in debating. Because we had met them, the relationship builds. I think in a small community, it's good to be able to do things across schools. So these sorts of comments suggest that QTR appears to, I guess, have a positive impact on the structural dimension of social capital by assisting teachers to form new relationships with colleagues at their schools. It may positively impact teachers' position within networks, because that's based on the number of ties that you have. And it may also improve the overall connectivity within and even across schools. In relation to the relational dimension, so interviewers reported that QTR strengthened existing professional relationships by increasing the sense of trust and closeness among teachers. So Molly says, I think that one of the impacts is there was just a shift in our relationship with one another. I think we all became closer. As I said with Cody, I didn't have a lot to do with her, and I just felt like I knew her so much better. I think just that building of relationships definitely was beneficial. Avril said, I think QTR allowed us to work more closely, but also we gained trust for each other. And it wasn't judgmental. It was a safe environment that we could gain feedback on ourselves. So it definitely allowed us to work more closely and create better relationships with each other. And Lena was in a PLC who already were all on the same stage team, and she described as quite close to begin with. She says, we're definitely a lot closer now after QTR. We share things we've tried in our classrooms that we've found. Resources are shared, know-how is shared. We were usually quite close, so there wasn't a dramatic change after QTR, but because I don't usually work with those Year 3 teachers, it was really rewarding to go into classrooms and see how they're doing things. I think it strengthened the trust that we had amongst ourselves. So QTR appears to positively impact the relational dimension of social capital by providing teachers with a safe environment to open up their classroom to colleagues and gain feedback on their teaching. And finally, in relation to the cognitive dimension. So interviewers reported using the common language of the QT model to discuss pedagogy after QTR. And they said that QTR assisted them to realise shared goals. So Gina said that Toby and I already had a good relationship, and QTR has made it like some of the things that we discussed. We might say, how are you putting this element into your teaching now? Or when we're planning together, don't forget to add meta language into that. So it's part of the conversation that we're having. Daniela said that I think what we got from the quality teaching rounds, it was just a bit of an aha moment, because we could see with all the different elements how that linked in really well with our back to front maths pedagogy, with what we're doing in literacy with Fountas and Pennell. And for the teachers at our school to be able to see the quality teaching framework as a framework that lends itself to all other lessons that we are going to deliver in our classes. And Janelle said, we all had good relationships here anyway, but I think we're now more prepared to ask each other for a bit of a, what do you reckon about this? What should we do about that? I think it was those reading and coding discussions it was a really nice thing for everybody to see that although we had a different view of things, our ultimate goal was the same. So these kinds of comments suggest that QTR can also positively impact the cognitive dimension of social capital, the use of a shared language about teaching and the realization of shared goals among teachers. So looking across the data, it suggests that QTR has the capacity to have positive impacts across multiple dimensions of teacher social capital. So to bring this all together, QTR seems to be having this positive impact because it attends to the structure, quality, and content of teachers' relationships. So time and opportunity to interact with colleagues across organisational boundaries are important, but they're insufficient for social capital development. You can think of some opportunities that currently exist out there, like whole staff meetings or even just socialisation in the staff room, where you might actually get a chance to talk with someone who teaches a different stage or subject. But those opportunities may only require relatively superficial interaction among teachers. So QTR had the positive impact because it also strengthened teachers' relationships. The norms and protocols of QTR, turn-taking, confidentiality, focus on the teacher, help create that safe space for teachers to open up their classrooms, which increased feelings of trust and closeness. But QTR also promoted those shared understandings about teaching through the use of the QT model, observations and discussions, which help teachers to see the connections between different pedagogical approaches. The data suggests that if we want to build teacher social capital, it's important to provide teachers with those opportunities to work across typical organisational boundaries. But we also need to encourage teachers to open up their classroom. But that needs to occur in a safe place. So there has to be protocols in place to guide that interaction. And collaboration needs to focus teachers' work on deeply analysing and discussing the quality of teaching in a variety of settings. All of these factors appear to interact to produce positive impacts across the multiple dimensions of teacher social capital. So to sum up, I've probably gone over time, everybody, sorry. But the thematic analysis of my 22 interviews with leaders and teachers from the QTR group showed that QTR had a positive impact across many dimensions of teacher social capital. Teachers formed new relationships with colleagues they hadn't worked with before and continued their interaction after QTR. They felt that their existing relationships were strengthened and they developed shared understandings about the quality of teaching. This is particularly noteworthy, I think, given that COVID and learning from home was happening for most of these interviewees, so almost all of term 3. Yet despite this interruption, teachers still reported really positive impacts on their professional relationships. And just lastly, some insights into conditions under which social capital develops. Time and opportunities to work with colleagues across stage and subject boundaries, norms and protocols to ensure a safe environment for teachers to open up their classrooms and gain feedback, and engaging teachers in the process of observing, analysing and discussing pedagogy are all important factors for social capital development. So that's the end of me. Thank you. I hope that was interesting and it may provide some insights about ways to go about strengthening relationships among staff or promoting more collaborative and cohesive cultures. Thanks.
I was going to watch this because this had implementation science in it, but it's somebody's PhD where they used implementation science to roll out the work. That's not what I wanted. I wanted to hear more about that.
Thanks so much, Brooke, for your presentation. And I'll ask Anthony to come back on screen again. And so now we'll open up the floor to questions. Feel free to pop a question in the chat, use the raise hand function, or feel free also to unmute yourself and ask a question. So I'll open up the floor now for questions.
Somebody said before about wanted some information just at the end about implementation science, so they might have missed the first talk or whatever it is, because that's what my talk was about. But if you provide me your contact details or whatever it is, I can at least send you the presentation that I gave about implementation science, because I've certainly been working on it for the last few years, and it'd be nice to know that somebody out there actually was interested in that area. So, yep. If you just
I'm not sure if that person joins late, Anthony, in terms of your missing your session. But I'll ask a question potentially to you, Brooke, first, just to get the ball rolling. Do you think that some of the same findings in your study would apply for teachers participating in the digital form of QTR in terms of the impact on social capital and professional relationships? And how do you think it might differ?
That's a really good question. And it's kind of like something that I want to get into, but I just don't have time. I think that might change things a lot, and I'm not exactly sure as to what ways that would have an impact on relationships either. I just haven't been involved in the digital space. I'm trying to think of some factors that might be important there. I mean, obviously the norms and protocols, the observing is all the same. I suppose the main thing there is just that it's not being in schools, there's probably less opportunities to continue collaboration and interaction in that sense if you're working remotely across schools, because you're just not physically seeing the other person. But I still think that relationships can develop and resources can still be exchanged. So I've looked at relationships, professional relationships within schools, but then there's also the issue of across schools as well. So social capital isn't just relationships with the teachers who you work with in your school. It's other teachers that you may also get valuable resources from. I don't know if I answered your question, Sally, but
no, it did, yeah. And it'd be interesting to explore that more, I think, in the future.
Absolutely, yeah.
So there's a question from one of our participants, Anthony. I'm not sure of their name because it just has a number, but can you explain a little bit about how implementation science is different to translational research, if you might be able to clarify that a little bit?
Okay. I haven't done much in the area of translational research, but I said that the main difference to me would be that implementation science is the actual process of implementing something and getting it to wide scale adoption. But translation, I suppose, is to translate one thing to another area. So it's actually to move across, which, I mean, there's obviously overlap that occurs between them. So I can have a look more detail, but yeah, I think implementation science specifically involved with taking something that's already been developed and taking it to scale, where translation is actually to translate, to move across into a different area, which for us, well, also my research was involved in actually translating something that was developed in health science into education, but yeah, well, it was through the lens of implementation science. So
yeah, thanks, Anthony. So yeah, there is a couple of people in the comments as well who would love a copy of the slides, so I think we can organise for them to be sent up afterwards. So any other questions or comments about Brooke or Anthony's presentations, or just about research in general? Hannah.
Thank you so much, both of you. Really enjoyed all of that. I'm considering implementing QTR in an overseas environment, and so the implementation science is really, really interesting to me, especially like the dynamic culture part of the context. And you mentioned about the core can't change, and I'm just wondering, what if the teacher professionality is very different, and the knowledge base is kind of incomparable to Australia? I'm just wondering if
Barry.
Sorry. I'm just wondering to what extent, like, I know we don't want to lose fidelity, so I'm just struggling with not losing fidelity, but how to really adapt to a context where knowledge base is quite low, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, implementing in different cultures is a key concern, and a lot of the research that has occurred has been mostly in the States or UK or in Australia, and those cultural elements are essentially deemed to be fixed in the, what you're getting in terms of that, and it's almost at the same level. So implementing in different cultures is a key consideration, and there are a couple of people that are doing research in our centre which are actually looking at implementing in Albania and also into Japan. So those cultural aspects are really key. But I think you can still keep to the core elements of it, but we have seen adaptations in terms of delivery and also in terms of training that's required for people to change the level of background information that they have so that they can actually take it on board. So you can sort of build on the process, but in terms of actually, as Brooke said, giving people the time to consider their craft and to build on it, and also that safe space to actually do it, and the collegiality that develops and that sort of stuff. They're essentially what I would consider being the more core elements of it. And then we have actually looked at changing delivery options and also how you actually train it, and also whether you actually include a facilitator for the first series of rounds to assist people who maybe don't have the background knowledge to do it, but are able to get on board. So, that's basically what I meant by the core elements that are in it. So hopefully that sort of helped.
And tune in next week, Hannah, because we're having that presentation from Julie on QT in Albania. So that might be interesting for you.
Love to. Thank you so much.
I don't know, while you're here, Julie, is there anything that you wanted to add in terms of the cultural dimensions in terms of implementing QTR or QT?
Hi. So it's quite interesting to hear that you're wanting to take this into another culture. I wanted to take QTR into Albania, and I know Albania very well. I've spent 14 years in and out of the country. And yeah, I think, it depends on the culture completely, where you're going and whatnot, and whether they're at a point where they can actually take that on. For various reasons, I was not able to actually introduce QTR as a full professional development. So we actually broke it up and we introduced the Albanian teachers to QT, to the model and to individual coding, because that suited the context a lot better. Brooke's talking about social capital and, that relational aspect of it where you need trust, right? So you go into a post-communist setting and trust is extremely low. So, you don't want people coming into your classrooms and whatever. So it totally depends. There's so many factors that affect how it could be implemented and taken up. So I don't know, if you want to connect with me outside of this, that would be great as well. I'm happy to share any insight that I've got as well. So yeah.
Thanks, Julie. So yeah, like Brooke mentioned, next week, I think it's next week, isn't it? Next Tuesday. We have another PhD webinar. So Julie will be talking about her research looking at QT or introducing QT in Albania. And then we have another PhD student, Matt, who's looking at QT in math and drama classrooms. So we do have time probably for one other question or comment or anything like that. Just doing the awkward wait time to see if anybody wanted to pipe up with anything. If not, I'll hand it back to Rob, who'll just finish up the session.
Thanks so much, Sally. And look, I don't know, people probably don't realise poor old Sally's only just arrived back from Scotland. She's been over there doing some work and only arrived last night. So what an amazing effort. And thank you so much also to Brooke and Anthony for that just wonderful presentation on that amazing research that's being done. Before I let you go, just a little bit about what's happening. We talked about, or Sally mentioned, our next webinar on the 5th of September. We also have some other webinars coming up, one on the 14th of September, which talks about one of our elements of high expectations, where we unpack that for those people that are introducing quality teaching rounds. And then we have a webinar in term 4 on knowledge integration. Don't forget also, we have a range of offerings here at the Quality Teaching Academy, and you can see them there on your screen, not just quality teaching rounds in the classroom, but we also offer the workshops on programming and assessment and using the model as a lens to analyse our assessment and programming practice. And there's a QR code there that you're more than welcome to use. Otherwise, just get in contact with us here at the Quality Teaching Academy, and we'll do everything we can to help you with that. I'll hang around just for a little bit, but that's the end of our webinar for today. So thank you all so much for participating in the webinar. I hope you found it as interesting that I did. And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Brooke. And thanks, Anthony. Hannah, feel free to hang around and ask some questions if you wish.
Sure, thank you. I just wanted to check actually if Julie happens to be in Newcastle on maybe the 11th of September. But maybe she's not in here anymore, and that's okay.
Right?
When's the 11th of September?
It's a Monday. 11th or 12th, or even 13th.
Yeah, I can check with her.
Yeah, oh, thank you so much. I'll
Is
be in
that,
touch with you.
yeah, sorry, Hannah, is that, did you want to give Julie a call or just make contact with her then? What message would you like us to pass on to Julie for you?
I'll be in Newcastle.
Oh,
those days.
okay.
So I'm wondering if I could come to visit whoever happens to be in. And if I could ask you, Rob, do you know if it's better if I would visit to come morning or afternoon? Are you more busy in a certain time of day?
I'll tell you what, Hannah, we would love to meet you. If you don't mind being patient with me so I can check calendars, because sometimes we're off on workshops and there are people in and out. The primary person I guess you want to speak to is Julie. And so we'll check with Julie first, and then there are...
I noticed you put your email address in the chat, didn't you, Hannah? Yeah, so perhaps if you want to just jot that down, Rob, and then we can pass it on to Julie and maybe get Julie to send you an email.
Lovely, Sally. Yes, she also sent me hers, so that's wonderful.
Oh, great.
Lovely.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Sorry, Hannah, so that you've already exchanged email addresses, which is wonderful.
Correct.
All righty. And you said the 11th of September, didn't you, that you'd be in Newcastle?
Yeah, I'm more free on the 12th, but I know some people have some actual workshops on the 12th. But so it could be the 11th or 12th or 13th. But let me pen that. That might be easier to read than write down. But
of course. Oh, well, that's exciting. Well, hopefully we'll be able to see you on one of those days. We look forward to it.
Cheers. Thank you so much, Rob.
Take care.
Thanks for coming along.
No worries. Have a great Arvo.
You too.